He mocked the quiet maintenance worker in front of everyone, called him a pipe jockey, and laughed when he tried to speak up about a critical safety flaw. What no one realized was that the man he humiliated wasn't just another blue-collar hand. He was the CEO undercover. What followed was a stunning reversal that shook the entire construction site, exposed a dangerous culture of arrogance, and redefined what leadership truly means. This isn't just a story about justice. It's a story about transformation, humility, and the quiet power of a man who built more than buildings. He built a legacy. The summer heat had already baked the steel frames of the modular housing site by 8:43 a.m. Dust clung to skin like a second skin, and the hum of machinery layered itself over the tense symphony of drills' footsteps and clipped conversations. Ezra Lane adjusted the strap of his utility belt, glancing up at the scaffolding on the eastern wing. The bolts on the secondary support beams were off. He could see it. The angling was wrong, and if they installed the upper brackets without correcting it, the entire load would skew badly dangerous kind of bad. He had no clipboard, no hard hat with a colored stripe, just a faded navy work shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a name patch that read Z Lane. No one ever asked what the Z stood for. No one cared. "Let the professionals talk, will you?" The voice sliced through the air. Heads turned. The makeshift morning meeting was being held under a prefab canopy at the center of the site. Around 20 people, project managers, junior engineers, site coordinators. Even a few investors visiting early stood huddled around a plastic folding table covered with blueprints and iced coffee cups. And Ezra, standing just outside the circle, had made the mistake of speaking. "Sorry," he asked, caught off guard. Bryce Callahan was already striding toward him. Foreman of the site, barrel-chested, graying at the temples, and with the kind of smug posture that screamed, "I own this ground." "I said," Bryce repeated loud enough for everyone to hear, "this meeting is for professionals. We don't need commentary from pipe monkeys and maintenance boys." A few of the engineers chuckled, the uncomfortable kind that sought safety and alignment. Ezra said nothing, not yet. His fingers rested gently on the coiled tape measure at his hip. He could feel the burn in his chest, the familiar one, the feeling of being told to be small, be silent, stay in your lane. "I was just pointing out the angle issue on section D14, Ezra said, his voice calm. "If you mount that bracket line without adjusting the weight distribution, will—" "Oh, now he's an engineer," Bryce said, raising his eyebrows theatrically. "Did you hear that, folks? The maintenance man is giving structural advice. Now maybe I'll hand him my degree from Berkeley and call it a day." There were real laughs now. Ezra could feel the heat crawling up his neck, not from shame, but restraint. He took a deep breath. "Just thought someone should mention it," he said quietly, "before it becomes a problem." Bryce stepped closer. "You want to keep your job here?" Lane then stick to fixing toilets. Let the grown-ups do the designing. Ezra looked at him. The man's confidence was not just ego, it was armor built on years of assumed dominance. He wasn't just mocking a worker, he was protecting a fragile illusion of hierarchy. "I understand," Ezra said simply. And that was it. No one defended him. A few people looked away, others smirked. Someone handed Bryce another blueprint sheet and the meeting resumed, as if a man hadn't just been diminished in full view of 24 witnesses. Ezra stepped back from the group and stood near a column beam, his body calm, but his mind whirring. It wasn't the first time he had built companies, and silence watched from behind the curtain, while people made assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. He'd come to this project in secret just as he had done with every major build for the past 3 years. He didn't want a throne. He wanted to know the truth about his people. And now, he had it. As the team huddled again, debating timelines and concrete mixes, Ezra slid a battered phone from his back pocket. The screen was cracked at the corner. He typed one sentence. "Schedule an unannounced inspection. The CEO will be on site at 10:30. He hit send. Then he clipped the phone back onto his belt, picked up a wrench someone had left by the loader, and got back to work. Not because he had to, but because he still believed in earning everything, including justice brick by brick. The morning moved on, but something had shifted. Bryce Callahan barked orders louder than usual, waving his arm toward a pile of uncut lumber like it was a kingdom, and he the sovereign ruler of forklifts and foundation bolts. His steel-toe boots thudded against gravel with each step of entitlement. Meanwhile, Ezra Lane moved like a shadow, deliberate, unbothered. He carried a spanner over to the scaffolding zone, helping 2 new hires tighten their first beam fastenings, "Watch the way the wrench pulls," he said, soft but firm. "You want tension, not torque." They listened, not because they knew who he was, but because of how he said it. A man who'd done the work, who respected the work, who was the work for. Bryce, of course, didn't notice any of that. From inside the temporary command trailer, Bryce pored over time logs and supplier invoices. The windows were fogged with the temperature difference between the AC and the dusty heat outside. He muttered numbers to himself, already anticipating the performance bonus coming his way. Once he streamlined the foundation cost projections, his phone buzzed. He glanced down. 9:27 a.m. incoming message. Emergency site inspection, CEO en route ETA 10:30. Bryce stared at the screen. His heart didn't so much skip as stumble. The CEO, Ezra Lane, coming here. "Get the interns off the scaffolding," he shouted suddenly to his assistant. "Clear the west entrance. Someone get me a fresh hard hat, the white one." The trailer came alive, with clumsy urgency. Blueprints flapped, screens refreshed. Someone started wiping down tabletops with a rag that looked older than the building permits. Out on the field, Ezra heard the ripple of orders echo across the gravel. He caught snippets. "Get that gear out of sight. CEO's car will come down. The main access boss wants all contractors off the perimeter until after." He didn't flinch. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far edge of the lot, where a row of worker vehicles was parked on packed dirt. His modest gray sedan sat under a half shade of pine limbs. Dust clung to the tires. Ezra opened the trunk. Inside, a neatly pressed charcoal blazer, a clean dress shirt, and a slim leather portfolio case folded carefully beneath them was a navy blue lanyard with a corporate badge. On it, a sharp-looking headshot. The name printed beneath it. Ezra Dorian Lane, CEO, Highland Modular Structures. He stood in silence for a moment. The wind stirred the collar of his undershirt. A memory surfaced not of a building or a balance sheet, but of his father kneeling in the Georgia dirt, measuring a fence post with sunburned hands and saying, "Anyone can own land, son, but only the humble know how to build something that lasts." Ezra dressed quickly. Shirt button collar, straightened blazer, on his boots, scuffed but clean, remained unchanged. He liked that. It kept him grounded. Back near the entrance, the atmosphere was turning from casual to clinical. "We need this place spotless," Bryce was saying, voice tight with nerves. "Lane," he pointed, not seeing who it was. "Take those hazard cones to the utility shed. Right now." Ezra met his eyes. For a split second, Bryce paused. Something was unsettling in that look, calm and steady like a candle that refused to flicker. Then Ezra walked away, toward the administrative trailer unnoticed by most, not rushed, not hiding, just walking. "They still don't see me," he thought. "They never really do until it's too late." By 10:26, a sleek black Tesla pulled onto the main drive. Windows tinted, paint glinting like obsidian. The crowd gathered, stiffening their backs, brushing down their uniforms. A hush settled like concrete dust on a breeze. Bryce smoothed his hair with a damp palm and straightened his shoulders. "Here we go," he whispered. The driver's door opened first. A plainclothes security escort stepped out. Then from the back, a figure emerged. Bryce stepped forward, flashing his most practiced smile. "Mr. Lane," he called out confidently. Hand extended. "What an honor. We are absolutely on schedule," and the words died in his throat. The man who stepped out wasn't a stranger. It was Ezra. The same Ezra he'd silenced, mocked, and ordered around less than 2 hours ago. Now wearing a tailored blazer, a badge with a CEO title, and an expression so unreadable it could have been carved in stone. Bryce blinked. You're... Ezra adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. "Yes. Ezra Dorian Lane, CEO, Highland Modular Structures." His tone was calm, not smug. And that was somehow worse. The silence that fell over the construction site wasn't just stunned, it was historic. Around them, workers froze mid-step. Interns dropped clipboards. 2 junior engineers exchanged glances that screamed, "Oh no." Ezra glanced once at Bryce's still outstretched hand, then walked past it. No handshake, no small talk. Just the sound of a man walking toward justice carried by boots they had all ignored. The gravel crunched under Ezra's boots as he crossed the courtyard toward the main trailer, the same once where he'd been handed a rusted flashlight his first day on site, and told to start from the bottom, like everyone else. Only this time everyone was following behind him. Word traveled through the site like a flashover. "That's the CEO, the guy from maintenance, did you know?" No clue. thought he was new. Bryce Callahan stood frozen in place as the realization rippled through his spine like electricity with nowhere to go. The sweat gathering at his temples had nothing to do with the heat. He looked around searching for someone, anyone to meet his gaze and say it was all a mistake, that this was some twisted joke. But no one did. Most of them were now slowly backing away from him. Inside the trailer, the air conditioning hummed too loudly. Ezra stepped in, first placing his portfolio calmly on the meeting table, where hours earlier, Bryce had been spitting coffee and sarcasm onto his projected cost savings plan. A whiteboard still had the words 1 to 2 material cuts circled in red marker. Ezra glanced at it once, but didn't comment. Not yet. Bryce finally stepped inside behind him, trying to recalibrate his voice. "Mr. Lane, if I had known." Ezra turned. "That's the point, isn't it?" he said. Measured. "You didn't know. So you felt entitled to treat me like I didn't belong." Behind him, several senior engineers had filed in silently, along with a pair of women from compliance and a technical auditor from the safety division. Walter, the gray-bearded site manager who had known Ezra before any of this began, gave a small nod from the corner. Ezra met Bryce's eyes. "Sit." Bryce obeyed. For the first time in years, the foreman looked like a man shrinking into his skin. Ezra opened his portfolio and tapped his tablet. The device projected a display onto the wall, a structural diagram of the support beams Ezra had mentioned that morning. A red glow pulsed over section D14. At the bottom, a warning from an anonymous internal review. Misaligned upper bracket anchors, potential for shear failure under load stress. Needs recalculation. Your foundation draft ignored the slope variables. Did you know the northeast quadrant dips 4 degrees? Ezra asked. Bryce cleared his throat. "We compensated with additional joists. We ran it through the simulator." "Which simulator?" Ezra asked, eyes locked. "The one you manually bypassed to approve cheaper fill material." The room fell still. Ezra continued. "Because that simulator flagged your changes as non-compliant 3 days ago. Our logs show you overrode it, then falsified the results." "I was optimizing costs," Bryce said too quickly, his voice cracking. "The board wants margins." "And the board," Ezra interrupted, "wants buildings that don't kill people." There was a beat of silence that felt like it could collapse a bridge. Ezra swiped again. An audio recording played loud and clear. "Here we work with calculations, not with the eye of a guy who doesn't even know how to hold a tape measure properly." Bryce's voice echoed through the room. It was him mocking, dismissive, arrogant, and there was no one to protect him now. A compliance officer quietly handed Ezra a printed folder. "We found 17 violations across Mr. Callahan's last 3 site reports," she said, eyes down, "including unauthorized substitutions and 1 instance of falsified safety test data." Ezra didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply slid the termination letter across the table. "You have 2 options," Ezra said. "Top page termination for cause, civil proceedings, revocation of license. You will not work on any certified site in this state again." Bryce's hands trembled as he lifted the paper. Second page, Ezra continued. "You resign today, and in exchange you volunteer 6 months at the Horizon Youth Trade Program in Riverside, training kids from underprivileged communities in construction, safety and ethics. You'll return every bonus you received this quarter, and you'll do it quietly." Bryce's lips parted, but no words came, just the sound of desperation trying to translate itself into logic. "You have 5 minutes, Ezra added. "Then I'll speak to the crew." Bryce stared down at the contract like it was a bomb with a ticking clock. But Ezra didn't stay to watch him choose. He walked back out into the sunlight, the same sun that had baked the shame into his shoulders just hours earlier, and stepped onto a supply crate in front of the waiting crew. The workers gathered instinctively. Some crossed their arms, others took off their hard hats in respect or confusion, but all eyes were on him now. Ezra looked out over the men and women who'd spent the last month building something with their hands while being looked down on for it. "For those of you who don't know me," he said clearly, "I'm Ezra Lane, CEO of Highland Modular, but some of you know me by another name, Z, the guy who handed out tools and swept the scaffolding." There was a ripple of recognition in the crowd. Heads nodded, smiles flickered. "I chose to work undercover at this site," he continued, "because you don't learn the truth about a team from spreadsheets. You learn it from watching how people treat the ones they think don't matter." He paused, "And today I saw enough." He didn't have to say Bryce's name. Every person there already knew. The crowd stood in a kind of stunned reverence as Ezra spoke. It wasn't the title that held them. It was his tone, steady, measured. Not a man trying to flex power, but one delivering truth with the weight of lived experience. Some of you may be wondering why someone in my position would pretend to be just another guy with a wrench, Ezra said, scanning the group. The answer is simple. He paused. I wanted to see what our company had become when no one knew the boss was watching. A shift moved through the crowd. Quiet murmurs. The gravity of the reveal settled like cement into every open mouth and silent nod. See this company? Your company was built with the belief that greatness doesn't start in the boardroom. It starts on the ground in the sweat, the soil, in hands that hold bricks, not pens. He looked out at the welders, the scaffolders, the young apprentices with graphite-stained gloves. His gaze softened. And yet somewhere along the way, we forgot that, some of us at least. No one had to look toward the office trailer to know who he meant. Inside that trailer, Bryce Callahan still sat pale and sweating the resignation agreement, shaking slightly in his fingers. For the first time in his career, there was no protocol to fall back on, no hierarchy to hide behind, just the raw truth of who he'd been and how he'd treated others. Back outside, Ezra continued. I stood in that meeting this morning and got laughed at, because I wore a name patch instead of a badge because I dared to speak without a title. He let that hang. It didn't hurt because I was the CEO. It hurt because for a moment I was reminded what it feels like to be dismissed. A raised laugh out of the room because someone decided I didn't belong in it. A hush blanketed the courtyard. Then came the moment that would be remembered long after the buildings were finished. Ezra stepped down from the crate and walked slowly toward the center of the crew. He looked at a young woman in a dusty orange vest, Marisol, the welder's assistant, who'd offered him a bottle of water 2 days earlier. No questions, just kindness. He handed her his CEO badge. Take a look, he said with a faint smile. She turned it over. Her eyes widened. She looked up at him like she'd never seen him before, yet always had. I'm not handing it to you because of who you are, Ezra said gently. I'm handing it to you because of who you already act like, someone who understands that. Titles don't make leaders. Character does. He took the badge back and faced the rest. From this moment forward, Highland Modular will be changing its site protocols. Every worker, regardless the job title, will have access to report safety concerns, without clearance, without hierarchy and retaliation. The response was slow at first, but then it spread. Applause, not polite, not uncertain. It was earned. A group of electricians clapped first, followed by the security staff, then the welders, even the interns who had nervously watched Ezra clean toilets just 2 days ago. When the applause finally faded, Ezra's expression grew serious again. I know what many of you are thinking, he said. What happens next to Bryce Callahan? Silence fell again, almost expected. Ezra nodded toward the trailer. He has 5 minutes left to decide. One way or another, he won't be leading this site again. Not because of revenge, but because of standards. That line hit harder than anything else he'd said. Not because of revenge, but because of standards. Ezra Lane wasn't just cleaning house, he was rebuilding the foundation beneath it. He nodded once more. You've all got jobs to do. So do I. Let's get back to it. As he walked back toward the admin building, the workers slowly dispersed, but not before exchanging glances that were no longer indifferent. They looked at Ezra now, with a different kind of respect. Not for his title, but for the quiet strength behind it. Inside the trailer, Bryce sat motionless. The minutes were almost up. Walter entered the room and closed the door behind him. He crossed his arms, saying nothing at first, just watching. I didn't know, Bryce said, his voice barely audible. You didn't want to, Walter replied. That's worse. Bryce looked down at the form again. His signature would mean the end of everything he thought made him important. His title, his perceived control, but maybe not the end of everything. He picked up the pen and signed. It was just after 11:00 a.m. when the trailer door opened again. All noise on the site faded as workers slowly looked up from their tasks, and toward the admin trailer, Bryce Callahan stepped out first, shoulders square but visibly hollowed. No clipboard, no bellowing commands. Just a thin man in a wrinkled shirt carrying a cardboard box with his name scrawled across one flap. Behind him, Ezra Lane followed. His walk was deliberate, unhurried, like a final signature at the bottom of a long, silent contract. A low buzz spread across the crowd. Not mockery, not applause. Something more powerful. Recognition. Bryce stopped near the loading dock, where just yesterday he had yelled at a younger worker for stacking like a preschooler. That same worker now stood still, arms crossed, eyes sharp, saying nothing. Ezra stepped up beside Bryce and motioned for attention. "Gather round, everyone," he said. "There's something I want to say while we're all present." Slowly, like a tide, the crew converged. Engineers, welders, electricians, interns, mechanics, janitors. Not separated by role or rung, just standing together. Ezra addressed the crowd. Earlier today, Bryce Callahan made decisions that violated Highland's safety policies, our chain of trust, and our principles as a company. Bryce flinched but didn't look away. These decisions put lives at risk. Ezra continued. They were made for financial gain, but more importantly, they were defended with arrogance and worse, with disrespect toward the people working on this site. The silence was deafening, and yet Ezra added, his voice softening but not yielding. "We're not here to destroy. We're here to rebuild." He looked over at Bryce. "Mr. Callahan has agreed to resign, effective immediately." No cheers, no whistles, just quiet, stunned processing. And as part of his voluntary departure, Ezra continued, he will spend the next 6 months mentoring and training students at the Riverside Youth Trades program, free of charge. His decision allows him the chance to do something many people never get, to change the legacy of their actions. There was a ripple in the crowd this time, not of shock but reflection. No one had expected mercy, certainly not from a man who'd been humiliated just hours earlier. Ezra stepped forward. But before we move on, let me say this clearly, for those who watched that meeting this morning, for those who stayed quiet, and especially for those who laughed. His eyes swept across the gathered team, not with accusation, with honesty. Respect is not earned by what you wear or where you studied. It's how you treat the person you think can do nothing for you. There it was, the heartbeat of it all, the real foundation. From now on, Highland Modular isn't just about the structures we build. It's about the culture we live in. Speak up when something's unsafe. Step in when someone's disrespected, and don't wait for someone to be revealed as your boss to treat them like a human being. There was a long pause, and then the applause came. This time it was real. Workers clapped not out of duty, but conviction. Heads nodded, a few even removed their gloves to join in. Ezra stood still and let it wash over him, not basking, but absorbing it like a man who knew how hard it had been to earn. Bryce set the cardboard box down beside him. He looked around at the faces. Some met his gaze, most didn't, but none jeered, none mocked, and that he'd realize might be the hardest part. Because they pitied him, and somehow that felt heavier than hate. Ezra turned to him, voice low. "You made the right choice today." Bryce didn't reply, but something was flickering in his eyes. Something beginning, not redemption. Not yet, but maybe the first brick in its direction. Walter, the site manager, came up beside Ezra as the crowd began to disperse. "He signed," Walter asked quietly. Ezra nodded. "He took the youth training option." Walter let out a breath. "Didn't see that coming." "Neither did he," Ezra replied. "But maybe he saw something in himself he didn't know was still there." They stood in silence a moment longer, watching Bryce walk slowly toward the lot with his box. His stride wasn't defeated, but it was changed. Ezra didn't smile. He simply whispered to no one in particular. Sometimes the most important structure you build isn't a building. It's a man who forgot how to stand with others. And then he turned to get back to work. The kind that lasts. The courtyard had emptied, but something lingered. It wasn't just the echo of applause. It was the quiet rewiring of thought, like the moment after an earthquake, when you realize the building still stands, but something fundamental has shifted beneath it. Ezra Lane walked back to the admin trailer, not alone now, but flanked by Walter and 2 women from HR and compliance. They weren't there to manage damage control. They were there to begin something new. And it started that afternoon. At 1:00 p.m., a full site safety meeting was called, not in the usual back corner of the prefab office, this time under a fresh canopy erected right in the middle of the lot between electricians and roofers, laborers and apprentices. Everyone came, no one pretended to be too busy. Ezra didn't take the platform this time. Instead, he stood on the ground like everyone else. Walter spoke first. This morning was a wake-up call, he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the hot air, but not just for one man, for all of us, because what we allow, we become. He looked around. You all saw how fast things can go wrong, not just with concrete or scaffolding, but with people, with culture. Then he nodded to Ezra. Ezra stepped forward this time with a small notepad in hand. Starting today, we're launching the Highland Modular Open Voice Policy. He announced, "It means exactly what it sounds like. No matter your job title, if you see something unsafe, unethical, or disrespectful, you speak up, you won't be punished for it. You'll be recognized for it." Murmurs passed through the crowd. Not doubt, but cautious hope. Ezra continued, "Anonymous reports can be submitted digitally. But even more importantly, every crew team will elect a rotating site advocate, someone from the field, not the office, to attend management meetings and raise concerns directly." A young welder named Griffin raised his hand. Even if it's about a supervisor, Ezra didn't hesitate. Especially if it's about a supervisor. Griffin lowered his hand slowly and nodded. The tension in his shoulders eased. Ezra knew what that meant. Some people had been carrying more than tools. They'd been carrying silence. And one more thing, Ezra added. For the next 3 months, every site manager, including me, will spend 1 day a week working in a non-leadership role, not as punishment, as perspective. A few people blinked. Walter chuckled under his breath. "You're putting yourself back on grunt duty," someone called out. Ezra smiled faintly. "If I can't carry lumber, I shouldn't be directing the people who do." That got a laugh, not mocking, but respectful. There was something genuine in it, as if they were finally seeing not a title, but a teammate. After the meeting, crews returned to work, but the mood had shifted entirely. Where there had once been avoidance, now there were questions, conversations. Marisol, the welder's assistant, was seen teaching a new guy how to check the angle of his torch arc, even though she technically wasn't in charge of training. Griffin offered to help an electrician double-check the harness anchors before break. No one asked him to, and somewhere near the southwest concrete mix, a soft voice spoke. "Hey, you okay?" It was said between workers who yesterday hadn't even exchanged names. Culture doesn't change in policy alone. It changes in behavior. And Highland Modular, for the first time in years, was shifting from survival to sincerity. That evening, as twilight dipped the sky in copper and gray, Ezra sat alone in the site trailer, reviewing compliance reports. His sleeves were rolled up, tie loosened. A cold bottle of water sat beside a stack of safety proposals. Walter knocked once and entered. He didn't speak right away, just sat down in the creaky chair across from Ezra. "You think it'll stick?" Walter asked. Ezra didn't look up. "The policy?" "No," Walter said, "the change." Ezra finally looked up. His face wasn't idealistic. It wasn't bitter either. It was clear-eyed. "I think change sticks when people stop fearing what they'll lose and start thinking about who they can lift." Walter considered that for a long moment. "You always speak like your daddy used to." Ezra smiled faintly. He had better metaphors. I just updated them for the modern world. Walter reached into his pocket and placed a folded photo on the desk. It was old, sun-faded, 2 men in overalls laughing over a pile of bricks. One was Walter. The other, a younger man with familiar eyes, was Ezra's father. "He'd be proud," Walter said. "You didn't just fire a bad leader, you created room for better ones." Ezra didn't answer right away. He looked at the photo, then out the window where floodlights illuminated crews finishing their shifts in the waning light. Not rushing, not dragging, but working together. And for the first time in a long time, he felt it. Not triumph, but trust. The Highland Modular Tower now stood tall on the city's south side, its clean lines slicing through the skyline like a monument to modernity. 31 stories of glass steel and purpose, each beam a lesson, each floor a testament. But the real change hadn't taken place in the structure. It had taken place in the people who built it. It was a brisk winter morning when Ezra Lane stepped into the conference room. On the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in golden light. The walls held no framed diplomas, no awards, just a single mounted plaque etched in brass. "We build structures with materials, but we build respect with humility." Around the conference table, the quarterly executive team was seated. Walter sat to Ezra's left, now no longer just a site manager, but promoted to director of operations. Safety ratings have improved by 78% since we rolled out the open voice policy, Walter announced, tapping his tablet to project a graph. He let that sink in before continuing. More importantly, incidents are being caught early. Workers are speaking up confidently. We've prevented 3 major structural risks in the last quarter, alone. The room nodded, and Morale Ezra asked. Walter smiled. "Let's just say, no one's afraid of badges anymore." The group chuckled. It was the kind of laugh that came from knowing they had earned this shift, not bought it. And the mentorship program, Ezra asked, already knowing the answer. Walter flipped to the next slide. A photo filled the screen, a group of teenagers in yellow vests, hands raised as they studied blueprint printouts in a sunlit classroom. In the corner of the photo, a familiar figure stood, hunched slightly thinner than before. His tie crooked, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Bryce Callahan. Yes, that Bryce Callahan. Ezra leaned forward. Go on. Walter did. We've trained 52 students in 6 months. Of those, 94% have already received apprenticeships or job placements. And our most unexpected instructor, he tapped the corner of the image, hasn't missed a single session. There was a pause. Ezra nodded. Schedule me a visit. Later that afternoon, Ezra parked at the modest trade center in Riverside. The lot was mostly empty, save for a few well-used pickup trucks and an old van with Southside Youth Trades stenciled on the side in peeling blue paint. Inside, voices echoed from the far end of the training hall. He followed them. In a well-lit workshop room, a group of teenagers stood around a reinforced demo table. Steel brackets were being laid out. Safety goggles hung from their necks, and sawdust clung to their sleeves. At the front of the room, whiteboard marker in hand, stood Bryce. But it wasn't the Bryce of before. This Bryce had thinner hair, no designer shirt, no trace of the man who once barked orders across a construction yard. He spoke clearly, gently. When you're measuring load distribution, you don't just rely on what the model tells you. Bryce was saying, you trust your instruments? Yes, but you also trust your eyes. You trust each other. One of the students raised a hand. What if we're wrong? Bryce paused. Then you stop, you ask, you learn. That's how we build things that don't fall. Ezra didn't interrupt. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching the man he once had every reason to hate teach. When the class ended, Bryce started wiping the board clean. He turned and froze when he saw Ezra there. Their eyes met. Not a word passed between them at first. Then Bryce spoke, voice subdued. Didn't expect you to visit. Ezra stepped forward. Didn't expect you to stay after the 6 months. Bryce shrugged. I didn't either. He looked down at the eraser in his hand. I thought this would be a punishment, he said quietly. Teaching construction math to kids who barely passed algebra. I thought it'd feel like a prison sentence. He looked around the room. But they ask better questions than I ever did. They want to be here, and I realized something. Ezra tilted his head. Bryce continued, I used to think being in charge meant knowing everything. Now I know it means listening to people who do. He looked up, eyes not proud but clearer. I asked to extend my volunteer work another semester. He added, there are 2 kids here. I promised I'd help through certification. I don't want to quit on them. Ezra studied him. No bravado, no manipulation. Just a man trying quietly to be better. Request approved, Ezra said simply. Bryce nodded almost too quietly to notice. As Ezra turned to leave, Bryce called out softly, thank you for not burying me, when you could have. Ezra stopped at the door. I didn't build this company to bury people. He said I built it so people could rise if they're willing to start at the foundation. And then he walked away. No fanfare, just one builder leaving another to finish his work. The first request came from a small firm in Vermont, then another from a Seattle high-rise project. By spring, Ezra Lane's team was fielding calls from across the country, project managers, architects, and labor leaders, all asking the same thing. Can you walk us through the Highland model? At first, Ezra hesitated. He hadn't set out to build a blueprint for revolution. He just wanted the truth, and maybe somewhere along the way, a little justice. But it was clear now the world had been watching. What happened on that construction site wasn't just about one arrogant foreman or one mistreated worker. It was about how easily a hierarchy can forget its humanity, and how powerful it is when one person chooses not to retaliate, but to rebuild. Back in the Highland Modular Tower, the lobby was alive with motion. Architects presenting designs to clients, engineers comparing safety metrics, interns shadowing department leads without fear of being dismissed as just kids. The walls held no portraits of founders. But near the elevator bay, etched in black steel against a brushed aluminum plate, a new installation had appeared. Every tool leaves a mark. Make sure yours builds someone up, not down. Below it hung a framed photo, a candid snapshot taken 6 months prior. Ezra Lane's sleeves rolled up, was handing a wrench to a teenage apprentice on the rooftop of the tower, under construction. There were no suits, no fanfare, just 2 people building something real. Walter stood beneath the plaque one afternoon, hands in his pockets, reading it for the 100th time. He'd watched this place change not through policy memos, but through people who now understood that respect wasn't a bonus. It was the baseline. Looks good, doesn't it? He turned. Ezra had just stepped out of the elevator, tie-loosened eyes, tired in that way. Only purpose can exhaust a man. Walter nodded toward the plaque. I thought you weren't into legacy walls. Ezra gave a small smile. I'm not, but the team insisted, said they wanted every new hire to read that on their first day. Walter chuckled. They'll remember it, especially now that the industry's watching us. He handed Ezra a folder. 3 more companies want access to our training model, and get this, Calderon & Sons is interested in sponsoring the next youth cohort. Ezra flipped through the documents, slowly, expression unreadable. I never meant for this to be a case study, he murmured. No, Walter agreed. You meant for it to be a correction, and it worked. They stood in silence as people passed around them, talking, laughing, collaborating, the sound of a company no longer built on fear, but trust. Bryce called last week, Walter added as if casually. Ezra raised an eyebrow. Yeah, he asked if Highland would consider him for a formal return. Not management, just field mentoring. Ezra didn't react right away. He looked out across the lobby where 2 junior designers, one in a wheelchair, the other with a hard hat, 2 sizes too big, were sketching ideas on a shared tablet. I told him we'd think about it, Walter said, but only if the students vote for it. Ezra smiled faintly. Perfect answer. Walter turned toward him. You still think about that morning? Ezra nodded once, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that the strongest foundations are the ones no one sees but everyone stands on. Later that evening, Ezra visited the training center again. The final class of the season had just ended. Teens were gathering around a display table with completed mock-ups, bridges, platforms, modular joints, all designed with the kind of creativity that couldn't be taught in books. At the corner of the room, Bryce Callahan sat on a stool quietly reviewing a student's notes. He didn't look up. He didn't try to impress. He just helped. Ezra didn't interrupt. Instead, he knelt beside a stack of student submissions and ran a hand across one page, a hand-drawn rendering of a community center with solar panels and a rooftop garden. At the bottom, scrawled in all caps, were the words, "Built by everyone, for everyone." He smiled. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, he thought. It's what others decide to carry forward. And if that wasn't architecture, it was something better. It was quiet in the back lot of the Riverside Youth Trade Center. No drills, no chatter, just the dry hiss of wind stirring the trees and the metallic clink of someone loading tools into a trunk. Ezra Lane stood beside his car, arms folded, watching from a distance as Bryce Callahan finished packing. The sun had dipped behind the building, casting long shadows over the concrete. 2 silhouettes stretched toward each other, but not yet touching. Bryce closed the trunk and turned. For a moment, they just stood there. Ezra in his dark coat posture, steady, Bryce in a faded polo, and dusty jean sleeves rolled sweat clinging to his collar. He looked older now, not from time, but from truth. I figured you might show up, Bryce said quietly. Ezra gave a faint nod. You're heading out. Bryce gestured toward the car. Last day of the semester. I promised the kids I'd help them prep for the certification test next month, but officially my term's up today. He hesitated. Unless Highland has other ideas. Ezra didn't answer right away. He walked a few steps closer, close enough now to see the deep crease lines at the corners of Bryce's eyes, not from anger, but from learning to hold back words that didn't need to be said. You changed, Ezra said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. Bryce lowered his head. I had to. Ezra studied him. Most people don't, he replied. They stood in the silence of hard-earned growth. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't cold either. It was real. I used to think titles were everything, Bryce said, glancing at the empty lot. Thought being foreman made me untouchable. Thought being the loudest meant I was leading. He looked up, meeting Ezra's eyes. But none of those kids cared what my name was. They cared that I showed up, that I saw them. Ezra let the words sit. Finally, he asked, So why do you want to come back? Bryce took a deep breath. Because I can't build alone anymore. Not the way I used to. I want to be part of something where respect comes first. Where I don't have to be feared to feel useful. He paused. And maybe because I still owe you. Ezra shook his head slowly. You don't owe me, Bryce. Bryce blinked. You owe the next version of yourself. The one you're finally becoming. Another pause. Highland has no use for the man. You were, Ezra added. but it might have room for the one you're trying to be. The wind picked up again, swirling a few stray leaves between them. Bryce straightened his spine, but this time without puffing up his chest. He extended his hand. "I won't waste the second chance," he said. Ezra looked at the hand, the same one that once pointed at him in front of a crowded meeting and said, "Stay in your place." But that was then, and this was earned. Ezra took the hand and shook it once firmly. "You'll be evaluated just like everyone else," he said. "No shortcuts, no shields." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Bryce replied. As he turned to head for his car, Ezra called after him. "One condition." Bryce looked back. Ezra gave a faint smirk. "You don't get a company jacket until your students vote for it." A quiet laugh escaped Bryce's chest. Soft, genuine, fair enough. He got in his car and drove off not toward redemption, but through it. Ezra stood alone for a while longer, watching the last bit of light fade from the trade center windows. Then he pulled out his phone, opened a new message draft, and typed, "RE new mentor, candidate subject, Bryce Callahan. Note, he's not who he was. That may be the best reason to let him return." He hit send. Then he slipped the phone into his coat pocket, took one last look at the empty lot, and walked towards the future, not just as a CEO, but as someone who finally believed that even broken men could become builders again. 6 months later, the plaque was unveiled. Not during a ceremony, no cameras, no podium speeches. Just a Tuesday morning, just the crew. They gathered in the heart of Highland Modular's new flagship training facility, a sun-filled atrium with vaulted ceilings and glass walls that made even the roughest hands pause in admiration. On the far wall, mounted beneath a recessed beam lined with copper trim, was the company's new credo. "We build structures with materials, but we build respect with humility." EL. The initials were all it took, everyone knew. Marisol, now a junior project manager, ran her fingers across the etching. "Feels heavier than steel," she whispered to herself. Griffin, now leading safety audit, stood beside her. "That's because it is." They weren't talking about the metal. They were talking about what it stood for. In the main conference hall, Ezra Lane reviewed the latest quarterly reports. The numbers were strong. Contracts were growing. More companies had signed on to adopt Highland's open voice policy, some even abandoning traditional hierarchies for cross-functional mentorship models. But it wasn't the revenue charts that Ezra lingered on. It was a photo sent by one of the field directors. Bryce Callahan, now clean-shaven, is standing beside 2 young women graduates of the youth trade program. They'd just been certified in structural design and had been hired to assist on the city's new green roof public library. One of them in bold Sharpie had written across the photo, "He made space for us." Ezra stared at those 5 words. Made space. That was it, wasn't it? Leadership wasn't about filling rooms. It was about clearing the table so others could sit down. He stood stretched and looked out the window. Below, crews moved across the courtyard, like synchronized lines of motion, measured calm, focused, a far cry from the site he'd once walked undercover, carrying a wrench and a warning no one wanted to hear. Walter entered without knocking. After all this time, he didn't need to. "New mural's up," he said casually. Bryce helped paint the last panel. Ezra turned interested. "Really?" Walter nodded. "Didn't sign it, though?" Ezra smiled. "Fitting." They stood quietly watching as 2 apprentices walked across the lot, one guiding the other with a hand on the shoulder, pointing to the skyline as if to say, that could be ours one day. "Have you ever regretted not staying anonymous?" Walter asked. Ezra shook his head. "No." They needed to know who was behind the silence just as much as they needed to see what happens when the silent speak up. Walter gave a thoughtful grunt. "You ever think you'd rebuild the company like this?" Ezra paused. "I didn't rebuild a company. Walter, I rebuilt trust." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the tower, they had once nearly compromised with cheap decisions and arrogance. Ezra stepped out onto the rooftop garden. It was quiet up there, sacred almost. Bryce stood near the far railing, watching the light shift across the city. He didn't turn when Ezra approached. He didn't have to. "You came up for the view?" Ezra asked. "No," Bryce replied. "For the silence." Ezra stood beside him. "It's different, isn't it?" Bryce said after a long moment. "When you're not looking down at something, but out towards something." Ezra nodded. "It makes you smaller and bigger, all at once." Bryce turned slightly. "You think I've earned it? A place here?" Ezra didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, folded fabric navy blue. A company jacket, the one Bryce had joked about not earning until the students voted for it. This isn't about forgiveness, Ezra said, holding it out. It's about continuing the work. You showed them they mattered. That's what this jacket represents now. Bryce took it carefully, like it might tear if he gripped it too hard. Thank you, he whispered, for seeing more in me than I saw in myself. Ezra gave a soft smile. That's what builders do. Bryce, we don't just fix what's broken, we imagine what can be created from the wreckage. They stood together in the fading light, two men once divided by ego, now united by transformation. And below them across the city, they were helping reshape beams. Rows, cranes, spun, foundations were poured, not just with concrete but with care, precision, purpose. Ezra Lane didn't build monuments for praise. He built them to remind people that respect isn't given to the powerful, it's granted to the humble. And in that lesson, carried through crews passed down from mentor to student, he built something no blueprint could capture. A world where no one is invisible and no voice goes unheard. Ultimately, this story reminds us of something far more valuable than blueprints and budgets, that true leadership isn't measured by titles or salaries, but by how we treat those with none. Ezra Lane didn't seek revenge. He built redemption. And Bryce Callahan didn't just fall, he rose brick by brick into a better version of himself. This is more than poetic justice. It's proof that workplaces can change, and people can too. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of the power of quiet dignity, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling stories that touch hearts, challenge systems, and build something better together.